Ashenmeres Destiny. Taken prisoner by Sir Rhys Montrose, the enemy of her house, Lady Juliana of Thornmere expected cruelty. Instead, he watched her with unreadable eyes, his voice dangerously soft. "You are worth a kingdom in ransom, my lady," he murmured. "But tell me, if given the choice, would you return home or would you stay?" Chapter 1. The Eagle's Shadow. The world had shrunk to the size of a cage. Not a literal cage. Of course, Lady Juliana of Thornmere was no common criminal, to be tossed into a dungeon and forgotten. Her prison was far more gilded, a suite of rooms in the West Tower of Castle Draken, the ancestral seat of the Montrose family, her family's sworn enemies. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating the rich tapestries depicting scenes of hunt and hawk, but the beauty did nothing to soothe the turmoil within her. 3 days. 3 days since the disastrous skirmish at the border, since the banners of Thornmere had been trampled beneath the hooves of Montrose's warhorses. 3 days since she had last seen her brother, Edward, his face pale but determined as he ordered her to flee, to seek refuge in the nearby abbey. She had refused, of course. A lady of Thornmere did not flee. She would stand and fight, even if it meant this. Capture. The heavy oak door creaked open, and a serving woman entered, her head bowed, her hands clasped before her. She was a slight creature, with mousy brown hair and eyes that darted nervously around the room, avoiding Juliana's gaze. "My lady," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "Lord Montrose requests your presence at the evening meal." Juliana lifted her chin. "Requests?" she echoed, a hint of ice in her tone. "I am his prisoner, not his guest. He may command, but he does not request." The serving woman flinched, but remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Juliana sighed, the fight momentarily draining out of her. What was the point of venting her anger on this hapless creature? She was merely a pawn, just as Juliana herself was. "Very well," Juliana said, rising from the window seat. "Lead the way." The walk to the Great Hall was a journey through enemy territory. Every stone, every tapestry, every shadowed corner seemed to whisper of Montrose's power, of Thornmere's defeat. The very air felt heavy with the scent of their ancient rivalry, a bitter tang that clung to the back of her throat. She passed guards in Montrose livery, their faces impassive, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. They did not bow, but their eyes followed her, cold and assessing. The great hall was a blaze of light and noise. Torches flickered in wall sconces, casting dancing shadows on the high, vaulted ceiling. A long table, laden with food and drink, stretched the length of the room. At the head sat Sir Rhys Montrose, the Eagle of Draken, the man who held her captive. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps no more than 35. His hair was the color of raven's wings, his eyes a startling shade of gray, like the storm clouds that gathered over the mountains in winter. He was not conventionally handsome, but there was a power in his features, a sharpness in his gaze, that commanded attention. He wore a dark tunic, embroidered with the silver eagle of his house, and a heavy chain of office around his neck. As she approached, the conversation around the table died down. All eyes turned to her, curious, speculative. Juliana met their gazes with a steady, unwavering stare, refusing to show any sign of weakness or fear. Montrose rose from his seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, a low rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Welcome to Draken." "I am hardly here by choice, Lord Montrose," she replied, her voice cool and even. He inclined his head, acknowledging her point. "Indeed. But I trust you will find your accommodations suitable." "Suitable for a prisoner, no doubt," she said, her gaze sweeping over the opulent surroundings. He chuckled, a low, throaty sound. "You are worth a kingdom in ransom, my lady. I would be a fool to treat you ill." He gestured to the seat beside him. "Please be seated." Juliana hesitated for a moment, then took the offered seat. The chair was heavy, carved from dark wood, and the cushion was embroidered with the Montrose eagle. She felt its gaze upon her, even in its inanimate form. The meal was a lavish affair, with roasted meats, spiced wines, and delicate pastries. But Juliana had little appetite. She picked at her food, her mind racing, trying to decipher Montrose's intentions. He spoke to her politely, even courteously, asking about her family, her home, her interests. He seemed genuinely interested, but she knew better than to trust him. This was a game, a subtle dance of power and manipulation. "Your brother fought bravely," Montrose said at one point, his gaze fixed on hers. "He has the heart of a lion." Juliana's hand tightened around her goblet. "He would have preferred victory to your compliments." Montrose's smile did not waver. "Victory is a fickle mistress, my lady. She favors the bold, but she also rewards the cunning." "And are you both bold and cunning, Lord Montrose?" she asked, her voice laced with challenge. "I strive to be," he replied, his eyes holding hers. "But tell me, Lady Juliana, if given the choice, would you return home or would you stay?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a test, she knew, a probe into her loyalties, her desires. Her heart ached for Thornmere, for the familiar comfort of her home, for the faces of her family. But there was something else, too, a flicker of something she could not name, a strange pull towards this enigmatic man, her captor, her enemy. She drew herself up, and with steady eyes met his. "A lady of Thornmere belongs with her own people, Lord Montrose." His expression remained unreadable, but a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, acknowledged her defiant response. The air in the hall seemed to crackle with unspoken tension, the weight of their shared history, their uncertain future, pressing down on them both. The feast continued, but for Juliana, the world had once again narrowed, this time to the confines of the silent battle waged between her and the Eagle of Draken. And within that space, an unsettling, unwanted seed of curiosity had begun to sprout. The seed of what if. Chapter 2. Chains of Gold. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Juliana was a prisoner, yes, but a prisoner treated with an almost unsettling degree of respect. She was given free rein of the castle, save for the armory and the outer walls. She was attended by servants who, while wary, were unfailingly polite. She was even provided with materials for her embroidery, a pastime she had always found soothing, though now the intricate stitches felt more like a way to keep her hands busy, her mind from spiraling. The gold of her chains was in the courtesy, the careful attention, the unspoken awareness of her presence that permeated Draken's stone walls. Sir Rhys Montrose remained an enigma. He was present at every meal, engaging her in conversations that ranged from the mundane to the philosophical. He spoke of his vision for the future, of his desire for peace between their houses, a peace that seemed impossible given the centuries of bloodshed. He spoke of his late wife, a woman he had clearly loved deeply, her death leaving a shadow in his eyes that even his most carefully constructed composure could not entirely conceal. He never pressed her for information about Thornmere's defenses, never threatened her or her family. It was this, more than anything, that unnerved her. A cruel enemy was predictable. A courteous one was a mystery, a carefully laid trap waiting to be sprung. One afternoon, she found herself in the castle library, a vast chamber filled with ancient tomes and scrolls. The scent of old parchment and leather was comforting, a familiar haven in this unfamiliar place. She was tracing the illuminated letters of a manuscript when Montrose entered, his footsteps silent on the thick carpets. "You have a fondness for books, Lady Juliana," he observed, his voice a low murmur that blended with the quiet rustle of the pages. "Knowledge is a weapon, Lord Montrose," she replied, without looking up. "And a prisoner must arm herself, as best she can." He chuckled softly. "Indeed. But knowledge can also be a solace, a refuge from the storms of the world." She finally looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "And what storms do you seek refuge from, Lord Montrose?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, a flicker of something pain, regret, vulnerability crossed his face. The same storms that haunt us all, my lady, he said quietly. Loss, regret, the burden of duty. He moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. I lost my wife 3 years ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She died in childbirth, along with our child. Juliana's breath caught in her throat. She had not known. She had assumed he was like all the other men of his ilk, driven by ambition and power, untouched by the softer emotions. I am sorry, Lord Montrose, she said, the words feeling inadequate, clumsy. He gave a small, sad smile. Grief is a lonely burden, my lady. It makes prisoners of us all. For the first time, she saw him not as her captor, not as the enemy of her house, but as a man who had suffered, who had loved and lost. And in that moment, the walls between them, the walls built of hatred and mistrust, seemed to crumble, just a little. He turned, his gaze falling on the manuscript she had been studying. That is a rare text, he said, his voice regaining its composure. It tells the story of the first Montrose, a knight who betrayed his king for love. Juliana frowned. A tale of dishonor? A tale of choice, he corrected. He chose love over duty, and paid the price. He paused, his eyes meeting hers again. We all face such choices, my lady. Moments when our hearts pull us in one direction, and our duty in another. The unspoken question hung in the air, the same question he had posed at their first meeting. Would you return home, or would you stay? This time, however, the question felt different. It was no longer a test, but an invitation, an opening into his soul, a glimpse of the man beneath the armor. She found herself unable to answer, her throat tight with a confusion of emotions. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with the growing awareness of something fragile, something dangerous, blooming in the space between them. The library, once a refuge, now felt charged, the air alive with a tension she could not deny. She was beginning to understand the nature of her gilded chains, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that they might not be entirely unwelcome. The sound of a distant horn, signaling the return of a hunting party, broke the spell. Montrose straightened, the mask of composure slipping back into place. I must attend to my duties, he said, his voice once again the cool, controlled tone of a lord. I trust you will find your afternoon instructive. He bowed, a formal, courtly gesture, and left the library, leaving Juliana alone with her thoughts, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The seed of curiosity had taken root, and now, a tendril of something far more dangerous, a hesitant, fragile empathy, was beginning to unfurl. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Stone. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath, the ancient stones whispering secrets Juliana strained to understand. Draken was a fortress, yes, but it was also a home. The echoes of generations of Montroses resonated in the halls, in the worn steps of the spiral staircases, in the faded portraits that lined the gallery. She began to explore, drawn by an irresistible curiosity, a need to understand the world of her captor, the world that had so unexpectedly become her own, at least for now. She discovered a hidden chapel, tucked away in a quiet corner of the castle. It was small, intimate, with stained glass windows depicting scenes of saints and martyrs. The air was cool and still, scented with a faint aroma of incense and beeswax. She found herself drawn to this sanctuary, spending hours there, sitting in the quiet solitude, letting the peace seep into her troubled soul. It was a place where she could escape the weight of her captivity, the constant awareness of being watched, of being other. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the chapel floor, she heard a soft footstep behind her. She turned, expecting to see a servant, but it was Sir Rhys Montrose. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. I did not mean to intrude, he said, his voice low and respectful. You are not intruding, Juliana replied, her voice barely a whisper. This is your chapel. He nodded, stepping inside. It was my wife's favorite place, he said, his gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings. She found solace here. He moved to stand beside her, looking up at the stained glass windows. She believed in the power of prayer, he continued, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness. She believed that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. Juliana looked at him, her heart aching for the pain she saw in his eyes. Do you believe that, Lord Montrose? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the image of a kneeling saint. I want to, he finally said, his voice raw with emotion. But it is difficult. The world is a harsh place, Lady Juliana. It tests our faith, our beliefs. And yet, she said softly, we must find something to hold on to. Something to give us strength. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. And what do you hold on to, my lady? She thought of Thornmere, of her brother, of her people. She thought of the duty that bound her, the loyalty that defined her. But she also thought of the quiet moments in this chapel, of the unexpected conversations with Montrose, of the growing sense of connection she felt with him. Hope, she said, the word a fragile whisper in the stillness of the chapel. I hold on to hope. His gaze lingered on hers, a silent acknowledgement of the shared vulnerability, the shared longing for something more than the endless cycle of conflict and loss. He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers, as if he wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but then he drew back, his fingers clenching into a fist. Hope is a precious thing, my lady, he said, his voice regaining its composure. Guard it well. He turned to leave, but then paused at the doorway, looking back at her. There are whispers in this castle, Lady Juliana, he said, his voice low and serious. Whispers of plots and betrayals. Be careful who you trust. The warning sent a chill down her spine. She knew that Draken was not only a fortress, but also a nest of vipers, a place where courtly manners masked deadly rivalries. She had been so focused on Montrose, on deciphering his intentions, that she had forgotten the other players in this dangerous game. Who should I not trust, Lord Montrose? She asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Trust your instincts, my lady, he finally said. And be wary of those who smile too sweetly. He left her then, alone in the gathering darkness, his warning echoing in the silence. The whispers in the stone had taken on a new, more sinister meaning. She was not only a prisoner of Montrose, but a pawn in a larger game, a game she did not yet understand. The fragile peace she had found in the chapel was shattered, replaced by a renewed sense of unease, of vulnerability. But beneath the fear, a spark of determination flickered. She would not be a passive pawn. She would learn the rules of this game, and she would play to win. Even if it meant navigating the treacherous currents of Draken's court and facing the unsettling truth of her own growing feelings for her captor. The stone had whispered she would have to learn to decipher the language. Chapter 4. The Night's Vigil. Sleep eluded Juliana that night. Montrose's warning echoed in her mind, mingling with the unsettling awareness of her own shifting emotions. She tossed and turned in the large, unfamiliar bed, the silken sheets feeling like a suffocating shroud. The whispers of Draken seemed to press in on her, filling the room with shadows and doubts. Finally, she rose, unable to bear the confines of her chamber any longer. She wrapped a heavy cloak around her shoulders and slipped out into the corridor. The castle was silent, the only sounds the faint creak of the timbers and the distant hoot of an owl. She wandered through the darkened halls, her footsteps echoing on the stone floors. She found herself drawn to the battlements, the high, windswept walls that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating the rolling hills and the dark, forbidding forest that bordered the castle grounds. She was not alone. Sir Rhys Montrose stood at the edge of the battlements, his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his sword at his side, his posture that of a man keeping watch. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach him or retreat. But something drew her forward, a silent understanding, a shared sense of unease. "You cannot sleep either, Lord Montrose?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. He turned, startled by her presence. His face was shadowed, but she could see the surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by his usual composure. "I often find solace in the night," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "It is a time for reflection, for quiet contemplation, and for guarding against enemies," she added, her gaze sweeping over the darkened landscape. He nodded. "A knight's duty is never done, my lady. There are always threats, both seen and unseen." She moved to stand beside him, looking out at the moonlit vista. The wind whipped around them, tugging at her cloak, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "You spoke of whispers," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of plots and betrayals." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Draken is a place of secrets, my lady," he finally said. "My family has ruled here for generations, and with power comes envy, resentment. And you believe there are those who would harm you?" she asked, her heart beating faster. He shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders. "A ruler must always be wary, my lady. There are those who would see me fall, who would see the Montrose line extinguished." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And do you fear them?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Fear is a tool, my lady," he said quietly. "It can be used to paralyze or to motivate. I choose the latter." She sensed a deeper meaning in his words, a hint of a personal battle fought and won, or perhaps still being waged. He was a man of steel, yes, but beneath the armor, she sensed a vulnerability, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "I understand," she said softly. "I, too, have faced fear. The fear of losing my home, my family, my freedom." He turned to her, his eyes holding hers. "And yet, you stand here, my lady," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Unbowed, unbroken. His words sent a shiver down her spine, a strange mixture of pride and something else. Something warmer, more intimate. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with an unspoken tension. He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers, the same hesitant gesture he had made in the chapel. This time, however, he did not draw back. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch, light as a feather, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with a mixture of emotions she could not decipher. Desire, yes, but also something more profound, something that spoke of a shared understanding, a shared vulnerability, a shared loneliness. The moment stretched, suspended in time, the wind whispering around them, the moon casting its silvery glow. He did not speak, did not move, but his gaze held hers, a silent communication, a bridge between two souls, two enemies, caught in the web of fate. A distant sound, the clang of metal on metal, shattered the spell. Montrose straightened, his hand dropping to his side, the mask of composure slipping back into place. "The watch is changing," he said, his voice once again the cool, controlled tone of a lord. "I must return to my duties." He bowed, a formal, courtly gesture, and left her standing on the battlements, alone with the wind and the moon, and the lingering warmth of his touch. The whispers of Draken were still there, but now they were mingled with another sound, the frantic beating of her own heart. The night's vigil had revealed more than just the dangers of the night. It had revealed the dangerous, exhilarating pull of her own heart towards the man who held her captive. The space between them had closed, only to widen again with the cold reminder of duty. But the brief touch that remained. Chapter 5. A bargain struck. The following days were marked by a heightened awareness between Juliana and Montrose. The brief, almost accidental touch on the battlements had created a subtle shift in their dynamic, an unspoken acknowledgement of the attraction that simmered beneath the surface of their carefully constructed facades. They continued their conversations, their shared meals, their explorations of the castle, But now there was a new layer of tension, a heightened awareness of each other's presence, of the unspoken words that hung in the air. Juliana found herself observing him more closely, noticing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his hand rested on the hilt of his sword, even when he was relaxed, the way his gaze lingered on her, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. She found herself drawn to his strength, his intelligence, his quiet intensity, but also to the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his armor, the loneliness that echoed her own. Montrose, in turn, seemed to be more attentive to her, more solicitous of her comfort. He brought her books from the library, rare volumes he thought she might enjoy. He ordered fresh flowers for her chambers, the scent of roses and lilies filling the air, a subtle reminder of his presence. He even, on one occasion, offered her his arm as they walked through the gardens, a gesture of courtly courtesy that sent a shiver of awareness through her. One morning, he summoned her to his solar, a private chamber where he conducted the business of his estate. The room was richly appointed, with tapestries depicting scenes of Montrose's victories, a large desk covered with maps and documents, and a fire crackling merrily in the hearth. "Lady Juliana," he said, rising from his chair as she entered. "Please be seated." She took the offered seat, her heart beating faster. She sensed that this was not a casual conversation, that something of importance was about to be discussed. "I have received word from your brother," Montrose said, his voice serious. "He seeks to negotiate your release." Juliana's breath caught in her throat. Hope, a fierce, sudden surge of it, flooded through her. "And what are his terms?" Montrose picked up a sealed document from his desk, his fingers tracing the wax seal of Thornmere. "He offers a substantial ransom," he said. "Gold, land, and a promise of alliance."
En alliance.
The word hung in the air, heavy with implications. An alliance between Thornmere and Montrose, after centuries of bloodshed and rivalry. It was almost unthinkable. "And what are your terms, Lord Montrose?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions within her. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "My terms are different," he said slowly. "I have no need of gold or land. And an alliance, forged under duress, is a fragile thing." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I seek something more lasting, something more personal." Juliana's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what he was going to say. She felt it in the air, in the intensity of his gaze, in the unspoken tension that had been building between them. "I seek your hand in marriage, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. The words, though expected, still struck her with the force of a blow. Marriage. To her enemy. To the man who held her captive. It was outrageous, impossible, and yet, a part of her, a small, treacherous part, felt a flicker of excitement. She rose from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. "You cannot be serious, Lord Montrose," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and something else. "This is a mockery."
A cruel est.
He remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "I assure you, my lady, I am perfectly serious," he said. "This is not a jest, but a proposal. A bargain, if you will." "A bargain?" she echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "My freedom in exchange for myself?" "Your freedom and the future of your house," he corrected. "A marriage between us would unite our families, end the centuries of bloodshed, bring peace to our lands." "Peace?" she scoffed. "A peace built on coercion? On forced affection?" He shook his head. "Not forced, my lady," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I would never force you to do anything against your will. I offer you a choice. A difficult choice, I know, but a choice nonetheless." He moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "I know that I am your enemy, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and sincere. "But I also believe that we understand each other, that we share a certain connection." He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers, the same gesture he had made twice before. This time, however, he did not hesitate. He took her hand in his fingers warm and strong around hers. "I would not ask this of you, if I did not believe that we could build something together, he said, his eyes holding hers. Something more than just an alliance. Something real. His touch sent shivers down her spine. The weight of his words and the sincerity of his tone had turned the proposal, the bargain, into something profoundly more complicated. She found her well-rehearsed protests dying on her lips. I need time to think, she managed to say, her voice a choked whisper. He nodded, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. Take all the time you need, my lady, he said. But know this. My offer is genuine. And my intentions are honorable. He released her hand, and a chill followed as she stepped back, finally breaking the connection. The bargain had been struck, the offer laid bare. Now, the choice, terrifying and exhilarating in its implications, was hers alone. The future of her house, her own future, hung in the balance, suspended between duty, fear, and the undeniable pull of her heart towards the eagle of Draken. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Kiss. The weight of Montrose's proposal pressed down on Juliana, a heavy cloak of responsibility and uncertainty. She retreated to the solitude of her chambers, seeking refuge from the watchful eyes of the castle, from the whispers that seemed to follow her every move. She paced the room, her mind racing, trying to untangle the knot of emotions that bound her. Marriage to Montrose. It was a solution, yes, a way to secure her freedom, to protect her family, to end the centuries of conflict. But it was also a betrayal, a surrender to the enemy, a sacrifice of her own desires, her own dreams. And yet there was something else, too. A flicker of something she could not deny, a growing attraction to the man who held her captive. She thought of his strength, his intelligence, his quiet intensity, but also of the vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his armor, the loneliness that echoed her own. She thought of his touch, the brief, electric moments when their hands had met, when their eyes had locked, when she had felt a connection, a spark, that defied the boundaries of their enmity. She stopped at the window, looking out at the castle grounds. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She saw a figure walking in the gardens below, a tall, solitary figure, his shoulders slightly stooped, as if he carried a heavy burden. Montrose. She watched him, her heart aching with a strange mixture of longing and regret. She knew that he was a man of honor, a man of his word. He would not force her to marry him. He had offered her a choice, a difficult choice, but a choice nonetheless. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, expecting to see a servant, but it was not a servant. It was Lady Alara, Montrose's cousin, a woman Juliana had met only briefly, a woman who had seemed unfriendly, to say the least. Lady Alara was a striking woman, with raven black hair, piercing blue eyes, and a haughty demeanor. She wore a gown of deep crimson, embroidered with gold thread, and a jeweled necklace that sparkled in the candlelight. Lady Juliana, she said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of steel. May I enter? Juliana hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to allow her to pass. Alara entered the room, her gaze sweeping over the surroundings, taking in every detail. Lord Montrose has informed me of his proposal, she said, her voice laced with a hint of disapproval. Juliana's guard went up. She sensed that this was not a friendly visit, that Alara had an agenda of her own. And what is your opinion of this proposal, Lady Alara? Juliana asked, her voice cool and even. Alara smiled, a thin, cruel smile that did not reach her eyes. I believe it is unwise, she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. A Montrose marrying a Thornmere? It is unnatural. A betrayal of our heritage. Juliana's hand tightened into a fist. Lord Montrose believes it is a way to bring peace to our lands, she said, her voice tight, with controlled anger. Alara laughed, a sharp, brittle sound.
Peace? She scoffed.
Peace is for the weak, Lady Juliana. Strength is what matters. And the Montroses are strong. We do not need to sully ourselves with alliances with our inferiors. Juliana's temper flared. My family is not inferior, Lady Alara, she said, her voice trembling with rage. We have fought the Montroses for generations, and we have never yielded. Alara's smile widened, a predatory gleam in her eyes. And yet, here you are, she said, her voice soft and menacing. A prisoner, a captive, a bargaining chip. She moved closer, her gaze locking with Juliana's. Lord Montrose is confused, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He is still grieving for his late wife. He is not thinking clearly. She reached out, her hand touching Juliana's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. He needs a strong woman by his side, she continued, her voice dripping with venom. A woman of his own blood. A woman who understands his duty, his destiny. Her meaning was clear. She was not only warning Juliana off, but also declaring her own claim, her own ambition. Juliana pulled away from her touch, her skin crawling with revulsion. Lord Montrose is capable of making his own decisions, Lady Alara, she said, her voice cold and steady. And I will not be swayed by your threats. Alara's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing into slits. You mistake my intentions, Lady Juliana, she said, her voice hard as steel. I am not threatening you. I am warning you. For your own good. My own good or yours. Draken is a dangerous place, Lady Juliana, Alara continued, ignoring the question, her voice a silken whisper. There are those who would not welcome a Thornmere queen. There are those who would remove any obstacle to their own ambitions. She paused, her gaze holding Juliana's. Be careful, Lady Juliana, she said, her voice soft and menacing. Be very careful, or you may find that your freedom comes at a far higher price than you ever imagined. She made a subtle move with her hand, and for just a moment, Juliana could have sworn she saw the glint of metal beneath her sleeve. A dagger? Alara turned and left the room, her footsteps silent on the thick carpets, leaving Juliana alone with the chilling echo of her words. The serpent had kissed, the venom injected. The game had escalated, and Juliana realized that she was not only caught between her duty and her heart, but also between the ambition of a jealous woman and the genuine, if unsettling, offer of the man she was beginning to care for. The choice had become even more complicated, the stakes even higher. The whispers in the stone were growing louder, and now, they spoke of danger not only from without, but from within. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. The encounter with Alara left Juliana shaken, the veiled threat hanging over her like a sword suspended by a thread. She knew that Alara was dangerous, a woman driven by ambition and resentment, a woman who would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. She sought refuge in the chapel, the quiet sanctuary where she had found solace before. But even there, the peace she craved eluded her. The stained glass windows, the flickering candles, the scent of incense and beeswax, all seemed to mock her, reminding her of the fragility of hope, the ever-present threat of darkness. She knelt at the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, but the words felt empty, hollow. She could not pray for guidance, for clarity, when her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, of fear and doubt, and something else. Something that pulled her towards Montrose, despite the danger, despite the impossibility of their situation. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned, half expecting to see Alara, her face twisted with malice. But it was Montrose. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. I saw you enter, he said, his voice low and respectful. I did not mean to disturb your prayers. I was not praying, Juliana replied, her voice barely a whisper. I was trying to find some peace. Some clarity. He nodded, stepping inside. Alara visited you, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement, not a question. Juliana's guard went up. How did you know? He gave a small, sad smile. Draken has many eyes, many ears, my lady, he said. Nothing escapes notice here. She threatened me, Juliana said, her voice trembling slightly. She said that it was unwise for you to marry me, that it was a betrayal of your heritage. Montrose's expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of anger in his eyes, quickly suppressed. "Alara speaks for herself, my lady," he said, his voice firm. "She does not speak for me, nor for the Montrose family." "She said that you were confused," Juliana continued, her voice barely a whisper. "That you were still grieving for your late wife. That you were not thinking clearly." Montrose's jaw tightened, his hand clenching into a fist. "My grief for my wife is my own, my lady," he said, his voice tight, with controlled emotion. "It does not diminish my feelings for you." His words sent a shiver down her spine, a strange mixture of fear and excitement. He had admitted it finally. He had feelings for her. Feelings that went beyond duty, beyond politics, beyond the centuries of conflict between their families. "And she said I should be careful," she concluded, her voice tinged with accusation. He stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "Alara is ambitious," he said, his voice low and serious. "She has always desired power, influence. She sees you as a threat, an obstacle to her own aspirations. And are you not afraid?" She blurted out, feeling the need to hear the truth. "Afraid of what your own people might do? Afraid of the consequences of your feelings?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions she could not decipher. Pain, yes, but also something else. Something that spoke of a deep, inner conflict, a battle between his heart and his duty. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was unexpected, tender, and it sent a jolt of electricity through her. He used that hand to lift her chin, so she had to look directly into his eyes. "I have faced fear many times in my life, my lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have fought in battles, I have seen men die, I have faced my own mortality. But nothing terrifies me more than the thought of losing you." His words, raw and honest, stripped away the last of her defenses. She saw the truth in his eyes, the depth of his feelings, the pain of his past, the hope for a future that seemed impossible, yet within reach. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "I have scars, my lady," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Scars that you cannot see. Scars from the battlefield, scars from loss, scars from betrayal." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But I also have a heart," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "A heart that is capable of love. A heart that is drawn to you." He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a fleeting touch, light as a feather, yet it ignited a fire within her. It was a kiss of longing, of desperation, of hope against all odds. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that acknowledged the forbidden love that had blossomed between them, in the shadow of their family's hatred, in the heart of their enemy's stronghold. The scars of the past had been laid bare, revealing the depth of his pain, but also the depth of his capacity for love. And in that moment, Juliana knew that she could no longer deny her own feelings, her own desire, her own hope for a future that, just moments before, had seemed impossible. The kiss, a fragile promise in the face of overwhelming odds, had changed everything. Chapter 8. Beyond the Walls. The kiss in the chapel marked a turning point. It was a silent acknowledgement of the love that had blossomed between them, a love that defied logic, that defied duty, that defied the centuries of hatred between their families. They did not speak of it, not yet, but it was there, a palpable presence, a shimmering thread that connected them, even when they were apart. They began to steal moments together, brief encounters in the gardens, in the library, in the quiet corners of the castle. They spoke of their hopes, their dreams, their fears, sharing the burdens they had carried alone for so long. Juliana learned more about Montrose's past, about the loss of his wife, about the pressures of his position, about his desire for a different future, a future free from the endless cycle of conflict and bloodshed. Montrose, in turn, learned about Juliana's love for her family, her passion for art and literature, her fear of losing her identity, her fear of becoming just another pawn in the game of power. He saw her strength, her resilience, her intelligence, but also her vulnerability, her longing for a connection, for a love that transcended the boundaries of their world. One afternoon, he suggested they ride out together, beyond the castle walls. Juliana hesitated. It was a risk, a breach of protocol. She was, after all, still his prisoner. "It is time you saw more of my lands, my lady," he said, his voice persuasive. "And I would enjoy your company." She agreed, her heart beating faster with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They rode out through the castle gates, accompanied by a small escort of guards, but Montrose kept them at a distance, allowing he and Juliana a semblance of privacy. The countryside was beautiful, rolling hills and lush meadows, dotted with small villages and farms. The air was fresh and clean, scented with the fragrance of wildflowers and damp earth. It was a stark contrast to the confines of the castle, to the weight of responsibility and intrigue that pressed down on them there. They rode in silence for a while, simply enjoying the freedom, the beauty of the landscape, the closeness of each other's presence. "This is different from Thornmere," Juliana said, breaking the silence. "Our lands are wilder, more mountainous." "Each land has its own beauty, my lady," Montrose replied, his gaze sweeping over the surroundings. "Just as each person has their own unique qualities." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart ache. "I have come to appreciate your qualities, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Your strength, your intelligence, your compassion." She blushed, her cheeks warming under his gaze. "And I have come to appreciate yours, Lord Montrose," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Your honor, your kindness, your vulnerability." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Vulnerability is not a trait I often allow myself to display, my lady," he said. "But with you I feel safe." His words struck a chord within her. She, too, felt safe with him, safer than she had felt in a long time. Safer than she had felt within the walls of her own home, where duty and tradition had always constrained her, where her own desires had always been secondary to the needs of her family. They stopped at a small stream, dismounting and letting their horses drink. Montrose spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat together, looking out at the water flowing by. "I know that my proposal was unexpected," he said, his voice hesitant. "That it placed you in a difficult position." Juliana nodded. "It is not an easy decision, Lord Montrose," she said. "My family, my people, they would see it as a betrayal." "And what do you see it as, my lady?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She looked at him, her heart filled with a confusing mixture of emotions. "I see it as a chance," she said slowly. "A chance for peace, a chance for a different future, a chance for happiness." She looked away, suddenly embarrassed by her own honesty, and a tear traced a path down her cheek. He reached out, his hand gently wiping away the tear. "Happiness is a precious thing, my lady," he said, his voice soft and tender. "And it is not always found where we expect it." He leaned closer, his gaze holding hers. "I cannot promise you a life without challenges, without difficulties," he said. "But I can promise you my loyalty, my respect, my love." He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was deeper, more passionate than the one in the chapel. It was a kiss of commitment, of promise, of a love that was growing stronger with each passing day, a love that was defying the odds, that was breaking down the walls between them. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, not in the cold formality of a bargain, but in the warm, vibrant reality of their shared desire. They were beyond the walls of Draken, both literally and figuratively, venturing into a new, uncharted territory, where the rules of their old lives no longer applied. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Juliana felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility, a sense of belonging. Chapter 9. The Falcon's Flight. The return to Draken was marked by a subtle shift in Juliana's status. She was no longer treated merely as a high-ranking prisoner, but as something more. The servants were more attentive, the guards more respectful. The whispers that followed her were tinged with a new note of speculation. Montrose made no public announcement, but his actions spoke louder than words. He sought her opinion on matters of the estate, he included her in discussions with his advisors, He treated her, in every way, as his equal, his partner. Alara, of course, was furious. Her veiled threats escalated, her icy demeanor replaced by open hostility. She challenged Juliana at every opportunity, questioning her judgment, undermining her authority, trying to provoke her into a confrontation. Juliana, however, refused to be baited. She had learned from Montrose, from his calm strength, his ability to control his emotions, to use his fear as a motivator, not a paralyzing force. She met Alara's challenges with grace and dignity, refusing to stoop to her level, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. One evening, there was a falconry demonstration in the castle courtyard. Falconry was a popular pastime among the nobility, a display of skill and power. Montrose was a skilled falconer. His prized bird, a magnificent peregrine falcon named Shadow, was the envy of all. Alara, never one to miss an opportunity to show off, challenged Montrose to a contest. "Let us see who is the better falconer, cousin," she said, her voice laced with a hint of mockery. "You with your shadow, or I with my swift?" Montrose accepted the challenge, his eyes flickering towards Juliana, a silent invitation for her to join him. Juliana had never flown a falcon before, but she had always been fascinated by the birds, by their grace, their power, their freedom. She had watched Montrose train Shadow, admiring his skill, his patience, his connection with the bird. "Would you like to try, my lady?" Montrose asked, his voice low and encouraging. Juliana hesitated, then nodded. I would like that very much," she replied, her heart beating faster with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Montrose smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. He showed her how to hold the bird, how to release it, how to call it back. He stood close behind her, his hands guiding hers, his breath warm on her neck. She felt his presence, his strength, his support, and it gave her confidence. She took a deep breath and released the falcon, a smaller, gentler bird than Shadow, a merlin named Whisper. The bird soared into the sky, circling gracefully, then diving towards the lure that Juliana held, landing gently on her gloved hand. A collective gasp went up from the onlookers. Juliana had succeeded on her first try. She looked at Montrose, her eyes shining with triumph, with joy. He smiled back at her, his eyes filled with pride, with admiration. "You have a natural talent, my lady," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Alara, however, was not pleased. Her face was twisted with anger, with jealousy. She had lost, and she had lost to Juliana, a woman she considered her inferior, her rival. "Beginner's luck," Alara hissed, her voice sharp. "I think not," said Montrose, his voice taking on a cool, commanding tone. He placed Shadow on his own gloved hand and turned to Alara. "Shall we, cousin?" The air in the courtyard changed. The friendly competition was now charged with genuine animosity. As the birds were released, there was a collective intake of breath. Shadow and Swift mirrored their handlers. Swift, aggressive and reckless. Shadow, powerful and precise. As Swift made its pass, it veered course. Instead of going for Alara's lure, it dove straight for Whisper, still perched on Juliana's arm. Juliana cried out, a surge of protective instinct washing over her. Montrose reacted instantly. With a sharp whistle, he recalled Shadow, his own falcon intercepting Swift in midair, a flurry of feathers and talons. Shadow, larger and stronger, drove Swift to the ground, pinning it there. Montrose quickly retrieved his bird, while Alara rushed to hers, her face a mask of fury. "You did that on purpose." Alara shrieked at Montrose, her voice shrill with rage. "You trained your bird to attack mine." Montrose remained calm, his voice steady and controlled. "My bird was protecting Lady Juliana, Alara," he said. "Your bird was the aggressor." He turned and walked to Juliana's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "Are you all right, my lady?" His voice soft, filled with genuine concern. "I am a little shaken, but Whisper is safe." She stroked the small falcon, who seemed more startled than hurt. The crowd was silent, stunned by the display of aggression, by the clear demonstration of Montrose's loyalty, his protection of Juliana. Alara, defeated and humiliated, stormed off, her fury palpable. Montrose watched her leave, then with a soft whistle, released Shadow to soar, free and untamed across the sky. He turned back to Juliana. "It seems," he said, his voice low and serious, "that the Falcons have revealed the true nature of the game." The Falcon's flight had been more than just a display of skill. It had been a microcosm of the power struggle within Draken, a clear demonstration of the forces aligned against them, and a testament to the strength of their bond. Juliana knew that the danger was far from over, but standing there, with Montrose's arm around her, she felt a sense of resolve. She was no longer a passive prisoner, but an active participant, a player in the game, and she would fight, not only for her own freedom, but for the love she had found, the future she was beginning to believe in. Chapter 10. Threads of Deceit. The incident with the Falcons had exposed the depth of Alara's animosity, her willingness to go to any lengths to achieve her goals. Juliana knew that she had to be more vigilant than ever, that she could not trust anyone within Draken's walls, except, perhaps, Montrose. But even Montrose was surrounded by advisors, by courtiers, by family members, whose loyalties were uncertain, whose agendas were hidden. She began to observe them more closely, paying attention to their words, their actions, their interactions with each other, trying to decipher the complex web of relationships, of alliances, of betrayals that permeated Draken's court. She discovered that Montrose's steward, a man named Lord Balthazar, was secretly in communication with Thornmere, with her brother, Edward. She found a hidden message, a coded letter, tucked away in a book in the library, a letter that spoke of a plan, a conspiracy to overthrow Montrose. Her first instinct was to go to Montrose, to tell him what she had discovered, to warn him of the danger. But something held her back, a nagging doubt, a whisper of uncertainty. Could she trust him completely? Was he truly on her side, or was he playing a deeper game, a game she did not yet understand? She decided to investigate further, to gather more information before revealing her discovery. She spent hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, deciphering codes, searching for clues. She learned that Lord Balthazar was not only in communication with Thornmere, but also with other noble houses, houses that had long been rivals of the Montroses. It was a widespread conspiracy, a carefully orchestrated plot to remove Montrose from power, to install a new ruler, a ruler who would be more amenable to their interests. And then she found it, another hidden message, a letter from Alara to Lord Balthazar, a letter that revealed the full extent of their treachery. They were not only planning to overthrow Montrose, but also to eliminate Juliana. She was to be the scapegoat, the excuse for the rebellion. They would claim that Montrose had become infatuated with her, that he had betrayed his own people for a Thornmere woman, that he had lost his mind, his ability to rule. They would use her as a pretext to seize power, to install Alara as regent, and then dispose of her. The threads of deceit were finally unraveling, revealing a tapestry of treachery far more intricate and dangerous than she had ever imagined. She was not only a prisoner, a pawn, but a target, a victim in a deadly game of power. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she held the incriminating letter. She knew that she had to act quickly, that she could not delay any longer. But who could she trust? Who could she turn to for help? Montrose. Despite her doubts, despite her fears, she knew that he was the only one she could truly rely on. He had proven his loyalty, his protection, his love. She had to trust him. She had to believe in him. She had to take the risk. She found him in his solar, reviewing documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his eyes softening as he saw her. "Juliana," he said, his voice welcoming. "What is it? You look troubled." She took a deep breath and held out the letter, her hand shaking. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the library. Hidden." He took the letter, his eyes scanning the contents. His expression hardened, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching into a fist. He read it again, his face a mask of fury, of betrayal. He said nothing for a long time, and the silence stretched, taut and heavy. Balthazar, he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. I trusted him. I considered him a friend. And Alara, Juliana added, her voice trembling. She is part of it. She is the mastermind. Montrose nodded, his eyes filled with a cold, hard light. I suspected as much, he said. But I needed proof. He looked at her, his gaze softening. You risked your life to find this, my lady, he said, his voice filled with gratitude, with admiration. You have saved me and more. She met his gaze, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and love. I did it for you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And for us. He reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers interlacing with hers. There is an US, then? He asked. His tone was one of hopeful questioning. There is. She confirmed. He stood, pulling her up with him. We must act quickly, he said, his voice firm, resolute. We must expose their treachery before they can put their plan into action. The threads of deceit had been revealed, the conspiracy laid bare. Now, the challenge was to unravel it, to expose the traitors, to secure their future, a future that, for the first time, seemed within reach, despite the danger, despite the odds. The trust, so carefully cultivated, had been tested, and it had held. Chapter 11. A Dance of Shadows. With the conspiracy exposed, Juliana and Montrose moved swiftly, but cautiously. They could not simply arrest Balthazar and Alara without evidence, without risking a wider rebellion. They needed to gather more proof, to identify all the conspirators, to understand the full extent of their plan. They worked together, a team, their individual strengths complementing each other. Juliana, with her knowledge of codes and ciphers, her ability to navigate the intricacies of courtly intrigue, continued her work in the library, uncovering more hidden messages, identifying more players in the game. Montrose, with his authority, his military experience, his knowledge of Draken's defenses, began to subtly shift loyalties, to secure the support of key figures within the castle, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. They moved in a dance of shadows, their actions hidden, their intentions masked. They maintained a facade of normalcy, attending to their daily routines, engaging in conversations with the unsuspecting conspirators, all the while gathering the evidence they needed, preparing for the moment when they would strike. Juliana found herself playing a dangerous game, a game of deception and manipulation. She had to pretend to be the naive, unsuspecting prisoner, while secretly working to undermine the plot against her and Montrose. She had to smile at Alara, to engage in polite conversation with her, all the while knowing that the woman was plotting her demise. It was a test of her strength, her resilience, her ability to control her emotions. She drew on the lessons she had learned from Montrose, from his calm demeanor, his ability to use his fear as a motivator, not a paralyzing force. She learned to mask her true feelings, to present a facade of composure, even when her heart was pounding with fear, with anxiety. One evening, there was a grand ball in the Great Hall. It was a lavish affair, with music, dancing, feasting, a display of wealth and power. Juliana knew that it was also a stage, a platform for the conspirators to further their plans, to communicate with each other, to solidify their alliance. Montrose insisted that she attend, that she play her part. You must be seen, my lady, he said. You must appear unconcerned. You must lull them into a false sense of security. She wore a gown of deep blue, the color of the twilight sky, embroidered with silver thread, a subtle echo of the Montrose colors. She wore a necklace that Montrose had given her, a delicate silver chain with a single pendant, a falcon in flight, a symbol of their love, their shared hope for freedom. She danced with Montrose, their bodies close, their eyes locked, their movements mirroring each other, a silent communication, a display of unity, of defiance. She danced with other lords, other courtiers, engaging in polite conversation, all the while observing, listening, gathering information. She saw Alara watching her, her eyes filled with hatred, with envy. She saw Balthazar whispering to other lords, their faces grim, their expressions conspiratorial. She saw the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the web of treachery tightening around them. As the evening progressed, Juliana felt a growing sense of unease, of danger. She sensed that the conspirators were ready to make their move, that the time for action was drawing near. She excused herself from the dance floor, seeking a moment of respite, a chance to gather her thoughts. She slipped out onto a balcony, overlooking the moonlit gardens. She was not alone. Lord Balthazar stood there, his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the night sky. He turned as she approached, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. "Lady Juliana," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Enjoying the festivities?" "It is a grand occasion, Lord Balthazar," she replied, her voice cool and even. He moved closer, his gaze locking with hers. "You seem unconcerned, my lady," he said, his voice laced with insinuation. "Despite the rumors." Juliana's guard went up. "Rumors?" she echoed, her voice feigning innocence. "What rumors?" He smiled, a thin, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "Rumors of discontent," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Rumors of rebellion." He reached out, his hand touching her arm, his fingers surprisingly strong. "Some say that you are the cause of it all," he continued, his voice dripping with venom. "That you have bewitched Lord Montrose. That you have turned him against his own people." Juliana pulled away from his touch, her skin crawling with revulsion. "I have done nothing of the sort, Lord Balthazar," she said, her voice cold and steady. His smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Perhaps not," he said, his voice soft and menacing. "But perception is reality, my lady. And the perception is that you are a danger. A threat." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "It would be wise for you to leave Draken, Lady Juliana," he said, his voice a silken whisper. "To return to your own people, before it is too late." His threat, though subtle, was clear, as was the fear that must be driving the conspirators to reveal their hand so soon. Juliana met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I am not afraid, Lord Balthazar," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "And I will not be driven away." She turned and walked back into the great hall, leaving Balthazar standing on the balcony, his threat echoing in the night air. The dance of shadows was reaching its climax, the lines between deception and truth blurring, the stakes higher than ever. She knew that the time for confrontation was near, that the fate of Draken, of Montrose, of herself, hung in the balance. But she was ready. She was no longer a captive, a pawn, but a player, a warrior, and she would fight for her love, for her freedom, for her future. The music, the laughter, and the hidden whispers followed her back into the hall. The game was afoot. Chapter 12. The Lion's Roar. The tension in the great hall was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on everyone present. Juliana knew that the conspirators were ready to make their move, that the ball was merely a prelude to the storm that was about to break. She found Montrose, his face grim, his eyes scanning the crowd, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "They are ready," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Balthazar threatened me. He told me to leave Draken." Montrose nodded, his expression hardening. "I expected as much," he said. "They're growing desperate." He looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you ready, my lady?" he asked. "This will be dangerous." She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady, resolute. "I am ready," she said. "I will stand by your side." He smiled, a brief, fleeting smile, but filled with warmth, with gratitude. "Then let us end this," he said. He raised his hand, signaling for silence. The music stopped, the conversation ceased. All eyes turned to him. "My lords, my ladies," he said, his voice booming across the hall. "I have received disturbing news. News of a plot, a conspiracy, to overthrow me, to destabilize Draken." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Faces turned pale, eyes darted nervously, whispers broke out like wildfire. Montrose held up his hand again, silencing the murmurs. I know who the conspirators are, he continued, his voice cold and hard. And I have proof of their treachery. He gestured to Juliana, who stepped forward, holding the incriminating letters she had found in the library. These letters, she said, her voice clear and strong, reveal a plot to overthrow Lord Montrose, to install a new ruler, a ruler who would be amenable to the interests of certain noble houses. She looked directly at Alara, her eyes unwavering. And these letters, she continued, holding up the letter from Alara to Balthazar, reveal a plan to eliminate me, to use me as a scapegoat, an excuse for this rebellion. Alara's face turned ashen, her eyes wide with fear, with disbelief. Balthazar stepped forward, his hand reaching for his sword. This is a lie, he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. She is the traitor. She is the one who is plotting against you, Lord Montrose. But it was too late. Montrose had already signaled to his guards, who moved swiftly, surrounding Balthazar and the other conspirators, their swords drawn. Seize them, Montrose ordered, his voice ringing with authority. A brief struggle ensued, but the conspirators were quickly overpowered, disarmed, and bound. Alara, her face contorted with rage, with hatred, spat at Juliana's feet. You will pay for this, Thornmere whore, she shrieked. You will all pay for this. Montrose ignored her, his gaze fixed on Juliana, his eyes filled with gratitude, with admiration, with love. He walked toward her, never breaking eye contact. It is over, he said, his voice soft, but filled with relief. Juliana nodded, her body trembling with reaction, with the release of tension that had been building for days, for weeks. The crowd was silent, stunned by the swiftness of events, by the exposure of the conspiracy, by the triumph of Montrose and Juliana. Montrose turned to the assembled guests, his voice regaining its strength, its authority. Let this be a lesson to all, he said. Treachery will not be tolerated. Loyalty will be rewarded. And Draken will endure. He looked at Juliana again, his eyes softening. And let this also be a testament, he continued, his voice filled with emotion, to the power of love, of trust, of unity. A Thornmere and a Montrose, standing together, have saved Draken. He publicly took her hand and raised it, showing their unity to the crowd. He turned back to the now silent observers. I made a vow to you all, to protect these lands and its people. But I have made another, and it is one I intend to keep. He looked down at Juliana. He cleared his throat. Lady Juliana of Thornmere, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? The lion had roared, the conspiracy crushed, the truth revealed. But it was the quiet, heartfelt proposal, spoken in the aftermath of the storm, that truly resonated, that truly marked the beginning of a new era, an era of peace, of unity, of love. The hall erupted in cheers, a spontaneous release of tension, of relief, of hope for the future. Juliana, her eyes shining with tears, her heart overflowing with love, could only nod, her voice caught in her throat. The words were unnecessary. Her answer was clear, written in her eyes, in her smile, in the way she held Montrose's hand, a bond that had been forged in adversity, strengthened by trust, sealed by love. Chapter 13. Beneath a Hunter's Moon. The aftermath of the thwarted conspiracy was a whirlwind of activity. The conspirators were imprisoned, awaiting trial. Loyalties were reaffirmed, alliances strengthened. Draken began to breathe again, the suffocating cloud of fear and uncertainty lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism, a sense of renewal. Juliana and Montrose worked tirelessly, side by side, to restore order, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on their people, to build a foundation for a future free from the endless cycle of conflict and bloodshed. They made plans for their wedding, a grand ceremony that would unite their families, their lands, their people. It would be a symbol of hope, of reconciliation, of a new beginning. But amidst the preparations, amidst the public displays of unity and affection, Juliana felt a growing unease, a sense of incompleteness. She loved Montrose, she trusted him, she believed in their future together. But there was still a part of her, a small, hidden part, that held back, that hesitated, that feared the full surrender of her heart. It was the memory of her brother, Edward, of Thornmere, of the life she had left behind. She had not heard from him since receiving the initial ransom demand, since Montrose had proposed marriage. She did not know his reaction, his feelings, his approval or disapproval. She needed to see him, to speak with him, to explain her decision, to seek his blessing. She needed to bridge the gap between her past and her future, to reconcile the conflicting loyalties that still tugged at her heart. She spoke to Montrose about her concerns, her voice hesitant, her eyes searching his. "I need to see my brother," she said. "I need to explain. I need to know that he understands." Montrose listened patiently, his expression thoughtful, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew the importance of family, of loyalty, of the ties that bound her to Thornmere. "I understand, my lady," he said, "and I support your decision. We will travel to Thornmere together. We will speak with your brother. We will seek his blessing." It was a risky proposition. Traveling to Thornmere, the ancestral home of their enemies, even with a peace declared, was fraught with danger. There were still those who opposed the union, who would see it as a betrayal, who would seek to undermine it. But Montrose was determined. He would not allow anything to stand in the way of their happiness, of their future together. They set out under the cover of a hunter's moon, a full, bright moon that illuminated the landscape, casting long shadows, creating an atmosphere of both beauty and danger. They traveled with a small escort of guards, loyal men who had proven their allegiance, who would protect them with their lives. The journey was long and arduous, but Juliana felt a sense of purpose, a sense of homecoming. She was returning to the land of her birth, to the place where she had grown up, where she had learned to ride, to hunt, to fight, to be a lady of Thornmere. As they approached Thornmere, she saw the familiar silhouette of the castle, perched high on a cliff, overlooking the wild, mountainous landscape. It was a stark contrast to Draken, to its rolling hills and lush meadows. It was a reminder of the differences between their worlds, of the challenges they faced in uniting their families, their lands, their people. They were met at the gates by Edward, his face grim, his eyes searching hers. He looked older, wearier than she remembered, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He embraced her, a brief, stiff embrace, but filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and guarded. "You are safe." "I am safe, Edward," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And I am happy." He looked at Montrose, his expression unreadable. "Lord Montrose," he said, his voice formal, polite, but with an underlying edge of distrust. "Lord Edward," Montrose replied, his voice equally formal, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I have come to seek your blessing for my marriage to your sister." Edward was silent for a long moment, his eyes flickering between Juliana and Montrose. He led them into the castle, to his private solar, a room that was familiar to Juliana, a room filled with memories of her childhood, of her family, of her past. They sat together, the three of them, the tension thick in the air. Edward listened patiently as Juliana explained her decision, as she spoke of her love for Montrose, of her belief in their future together, of her hope for peace between their families, their lands. He listened as Montrose spoke of his respect for Juliana, of his commitment to her happiness, of his desire to unite their houses, to end the centuries of bloodshed, to build a better future for their people. Edward remained silent for a long time after they had finished speaking, his gaze fixed on the fire burning in the hearth. He was a man torn, Juliana realized. Torn between his duty to his house, the ingrained distrust of generations, and his love for his sister. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. Sadness, yes, but also acceptance. "I have always wanted what is best for you, Juliana," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I have always wanted you to be happy." He paused, his gaze shifting to Montrose. "I do not trust you, Montrose," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Our families have been enemies for too long. The wounds are too deep. I understand your distrust, Lord Edward, Montrose replied, his voice calm, respectful. But I give you my word, my solemn oath, that I will cherish your sister, that I will protect her, that I will strive to earn your trust, your respect. Edward nodded, his expression softening slightly. I see the love in your eyes, Juliana, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And I see strength in Lord Montrose. Strength and honor. He stood, his hand clenching into a fist. I cannot give you my blessing, not yet, he said. But I will not stand in your way. I will allow this marriage to proceed. He turned and looked out the window. Time will tell if this union is a blessing or a curse. He sighed deeply. But I do give you my permission. And I will pray that I am wrong. That peace can, indeed, grow from something born out of war. It was not the wholehearted blessing Juliana had hoped for, but it was enough. It was a step in the right direction, a crack in the wall of hatred and mistrust that had separated their families for so long. The hunter's moon, which had witnessed their departure from Draken, now witnessed their tentative reconciliation, a fragile bridge built between two worlds, beneath the watchful gaze of the stars. The past was not erased, the wounds not fully healed, but a glimmer of hope, a promise of a different future, had been ignited. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but Juliana knew that, with Montrose by her side, she could face anything, even the lingering shadows of her past. Chapter 14. Echoes of Loyalty. The return to Draken was met with cautious celebration. While the court rejoiced at the impending union, a sense of unease lingered, a subtle reminder of the deep-seated animosity between the two houses. Edward's conditional acceptance, while a step forward, was not the resounding endorsement many had hoped for. Juliana understood the complexities of the situation. Centuries of conflict could not be erased overnight. Trust had to be earned, not demanded. She was prepared for the long, arduous journey of reconciliation, for the whispers of dissent, for the lingering doubts that would inevitably surface. She found herself drawn to the people of Draken, not just the nobility, but the servants, the guards, the farmers, the villagers. She wanted to understand their lives, their concerns, their hopes for the future. She spent hours talking to them, listening to their stories, learning about their traditions, their customs, their beliefs. She discovered that, despite their loyalty to Montrose, there were those who harbored reservations about the marriage, who feared the influence of a Thornmere woman, who questioned her motives, her intentions. They saw her as an outsider, a potential threat, a symbol of their ancient enemy. Juliana did not shy away from their concerns. She met with them. She listened to their fears. She addressed their doubts. She spoke of her love for Montrose, of her commitment to Draken, of her desire to be a part of their community, to contribute to their well-being. She began to initiate small changes, subtle improvements to the lives of the common folk. She established a school for the children of the village, a place where they could learn to read and write, to expand their horizons, to prepare for a better future. She organized a market where local farmers and artisans could sell their goods, boosting the local economy, creating opportunities for prosperity. She worked alongside the women of the castle, learning about their skills, their crafts, their traditions. She shared her own knowledge, her own experiences, creating a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. She even learned a few phrases in the local dialect, which was slightly different to that spoken at Thornmere. It was a small gesture, but the people appreciated the effort. Slowly, gradually, she began to win them over. They saw her not as a Thornmere woman, but as a compassionate, intelligent, dedicated individual, a woman who genuinely cared about their well-being, who was committed to making Draken a better place. Montrose watched her efforts with admiration, with pride. He saw the change in his people, the growing acceptance of Juliana, the softening of their hearts, the glimmer of hope in their eyes. "You are winning them over, my lady," he said one evening as they sat together in the gardens, watching the sunset. "You are proving that love can conquer even the deepest of hatreds." Juliana smiled, her heart filled with warmth, with gratitude. "It is not just me, my lord," she said. "It is you, too. Your trust in me, your support, Your willingness to embrace change has made all the difference." He reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers interlacing with hers. "We are a team, Juliana," he said, his voice soft, but filled with emotion. "Together, we can overcome any obstacle, any challenge." But even as they celebrated their successes, as they built a foundation for a future of peace and unity, there were still echoes of loyalty to old ways, to old rivalries, that threatened to disrupt their efforts. Alara, though imprisoned, still held influence, still commanded the loyalty of some within Draken's walls. She had not given up her ambition, her desire for power, her hatred for Juliana. She continued to plot, to scheme, to whisper her poison into the ears of those who would listen. Juliana received a cryptic message, a warning from a sympathetic servant, a woman who had come to admire her, to respect her. The message spoke of a plan, a secret meeting, a plot to disrupt the wedding. She knew that she had to be vigilant, that she could not let her guard down, that the danger was far from over. The echoes of loyalty to old ways, to old hatreds, were still resonating, threatening to shatter the fragile peace they had so carefully constructed. But she was not afraid. She had Montrose by her side, she had the growing support of the people of Draken, and she had her own strength, her own resilience, her own determination to fight for her love, for her future, for the hope of a better world. The past was still present, a shadow lurking in the corners, but the future, bright with the promise of unity, was within reach. She would not let the echoes of the past drown out the song of her heart. Chapter 15. The Price of Freedom. The warning Juliana received sent a chill down her spine, a stark reminder that the peace they had so carefully cultivated was fragile, vulnerable to the machinations of those who clung to the old ways, to the old hatreds. She knew that Alara was behind it, that she was still pulling the strings from her prison cell, manipulating those who remained loyal to her, fueling their resentment, their fear of a Thornmere queen. She shared the message with Montrose, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes searching his. "They are planning something," she said. "They're going to disrupt the wedding." Montrose's expression hardened, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching into a fist. He had hoped that Alara's imprisonment would have neutralized her, that her influence would have waned. But he had underestimated her cunning, her determination, her ability to inspire loyalty, even from behind bars. "We will be ready for them," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "We will not allow them to succeed." They increased security, tightened their guard, doubled their patrols. They questioned the servants, the guards, the courtiers, trying to identify the conspirators, to uncover their plan. But Alara's network was well hidden, her followers discreet, their movements shrouded in secrecy. They could not pinpoint the source of the threat, could not determine the nature of the plot, could not anticipate their next move. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with tension, with uncertainty, with a growing sense of dread. Juliana tried to maintain a facade of calm, of confidence, but her heart was pounding with fear, with anxiety. She knew that Alara would stop at nothing to achieve her goals, that she was capable of anything, even murder. On the eve of the wedding, Juliana found herself unable to sleep. She tossed and turned in the large, unfamiliar bed, the silken sheets feeling like a suffocating shroud. The whispers of Draken seemed to press in on her, filling the room with shadows and doubts. She rose, unable to bear the confines of her chamber any longer. She wrapped a heavy cloak around her shoulders and slipped out into the corridor. The castle was silent, the only sounds the faint creak of the timbers and the distant hoot of an owl. She found herself drawn to the chapel, the small, intimate sanctuary where she had found solace before, where she had shared a kiss with Montrose, a kiss that had sealed their fate, a kiss that had acknowledged the forbidden love that had blossomed between them. She knelt at the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, but the words felt empty, hollow. She could not pray for guidance, for clarity, when her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, of fear and doubt and love. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned, half expecting to see Alara, her face twisted with malice. But it was Montrose. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. "I could not sleep either," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I am afraid," Juliana admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of what they might do. Afraid of losing you." He stepped inside, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "We will face this together, my lady," he said, his voice soft, but filled with determination. "We will not allow them to win." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "I love you, Juliana," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "And I will protect you with my life." He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was deep, passionate, desperate. It was a kiss of reassurance, of commitment, of a love that defied the odds, that transcended the boundaries of their world. But even as they kissed, even as they sought solace in each other's arms, the threat remained, a dark cloud hanging over them, a reminder of the price of freedom, of the sacrifices they had made, of the dangers they still faced. As they broke apart, there was a noise, a shuffling from the back of the chapel. Montrose reacted instantly, drawing his sword, stepping in front of Juliana, shielding her with his body. A figure emerged from the shadows, a figure cloaked and hooded, a figure holding a dagger. The figure lunged towards Montrose. Juliana cried out, not in fear, but in a desperate plea, a wordless prayer for her beloved's safety. It was not Alara. It was a young man, a servant, one of the stable boys, a boy Juliana had spoken to, had befriended, a boy she had trusted. His face was twisted with a mixture of fear and determination, his eyes locked on Juliana, but not with hatred, with a desperate, almost sorrowful apology. I have to," he stammered, his voice trembling. She has my sister. She said she would kill her if I didn't." His words trailed off, his body shaking, the dagger clattering to the floor. He fell to his knees, sobbing, his hands covering his face. Montrose lowered his sword, his expression softening, his anger replaced by pity. He understood. He understood the desperation, the coercion, the price of freedom, the sacrifices that were sometimes demanded. The price of freedom was not always paid in gold or land, but sometimes in the forced betrayal of those we loved, in the shattered innocence of a young man, in the constant threat that hung over them, even in their most intimate moments. The chapel, once a sanctuary, was now a stark reminder of the fragility of their peace, of the long road ahead, of the challenges they still faced. But even in the face of this new betrayal, their love, their commitment, remained unshaken. They would face this, as they had faced everything else, together. Chapter 16. A Shattered Vow. The revelation of the stable boy's coerced betrayal sent shockwaves through Draken. It was a stark reminder of Alara's reach, her ability to manipulate and control, even from her prison cell. It shattered the illusion of security, the fragile sense of peace that had begun to settle over the castle. Montrose, though deeply saddened by the boy's plight, acted swiftly and decisively. He ordered a thorough investigation, determined to uncover the full extent of Alara's network, to identify all those who remained loyal to her, to root out the remaining seeds of dissent. He also took steps to protect the boy's sister, sending a detachment of guards to rescue her from Alara's clutches. He vowed to ensure their safety, to provide for them, to atone for the boy's forced betrayal. Juliana, deeply affected by the incident, questioned the boy herself. She wanted to understand his motives, his fears, his desperation. She wanted to know how Alara had managed to gain such a hold over him, to force him to betray the man he had served, the woman he had come to respect. The boy, his name was Thomas, was young, no more than 17, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with shame and remorse. He spoke of his sister, his only family, a young woman who had been taken captive by Alara's followers, held hostage as a guarantee of his obedience. He spoke of Alara's threats, her promises, her manipulation. She had convinced him that Juliana was a threat to Draken, that she was a spy, a sorceress, that she would bring ruin upon them all. She had played on his fears, his loyalties, his love for his sister. Juliana listened patiently, her heart aching for the boy, for his sister, for the impossible choice he had been forced to make. She understood his desperation, his fear, his willingness to do anything to protect the one he loved. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his voice choked with sobs. I like you, Lady Juliana. I believe in you. But I had to save my sister. Juliana reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. I know, Thomas, she said, her voice soft, compassionate. I understand. And I forgive you. Her forgiveness was a balm to the boy's wounded soul, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped him. But it did not erase the consequences of his actions, the damage that had been done, the trust that had been broken. The incident cast a shadow over the wedding preparations, dampening the spirits of those who had hoped for a joyous celebration, a symbol of unity and reconciliation. It served as a grim reminder of the challenges they faced, of the deep-seated animosity that still simmered beneath the surface, of the fragility of the peace they had so carefully constructed. Montrose, despite his outward calm, was deeply troubled. He felt responsible for the boy's actions, for the threat to Juliana, for the failure to anticipate Alara's continued influence. He questioned his own judgment, his own ability to protect those he loved, to secure the future he had envisioned. He sought solace in Juliana's presence, in her strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in him, in their love, in their future together. I should have seen this coming, he said one evening, as they sat together in the library, the room filled with the scent of old parchment and leather, a familiar haven in this turbulent time. I should have been more vigilant, more ruthless. Juliana shook her head, her hand reaching out to take his. You cannot blame yourself, my lord, she said. Alara is cunning. She is evil. She will stop at nothing to achieve her goals. But I am responsible for your safety, he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. I vowed to protect you, and I failed. Juliana leaned closer, her gaze locking with his. You did not fail, my lord, she said, her voice firm, resolute. You saved me. You stopped him. You protected me. She paused, her eyes filled with love, with admiration. And you have done more than that, she continued. You have given me hope. You have given me a future. You have given me your heart. That is more than I ever dreamed of. More than I ever deserved. His expression softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. And you, my lady, he said, his voice soft, but filled with emotion, have given me a reason to live, a reason to fight, a reason to believe in the possibility of happiness. The attempted attack, the shattered vow of the young stable boy, had shaken them, but it had also strengthened their bond, deepened their love, reaffirmed their commitment to each other, to their future together. The wedding, though overshadowed by the threat of Alara's continued machinations, would proceed. It would be a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of a love that would not be broken, a love that would overcome any obstacle, any challenge. It would be a testament to the power of hope, of forgiveness, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Chapter 17. Where Honor Lies. Despite the looming threat and the recent betrayal, the wedding day dawned bright and clear, a defiant splash of sunlight against the backdrop of Draken's imposing stone walls. Juliana awoke with a mix of trepidation and excitement, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Today, she would become Lady Montrose, a title that carried both immense responsibility and the promise of a love she had never dared to dream of. She was attended by a flurry of servants, their hands deft and practiced as they dressed her in a gown of ivory silk, embroidered with silver falcons and golden thorns, a symbolic union of their two houses. A delicate veil, shimmering with tiny pearls, cascaded down her back, softening the severity of her braided hair. But beneath the finery, beneath the carefully constructed facade of a serene bride, Juliana felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Alara's threat still hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked, of the fragility of their peace. She found a quiet moment to herself, seeking refuge in the small chapel, the place where her love for Montrose had truly blossomed, the place where their bond had been tested and strengthened. She knelt at the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, not for divine intervention, but for strength, for courage, for the wisdom to navigate the treacherous path that lay ahead. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned, expecting to see Montrose, but it was Edward, her brother. He stood in the doorway, his face etched with a mixture of emotions: concern, resignation, and a flicker of hope. "Juliana," he said, his voice low and guarded. "Are you certain about this?" She rose, her gaze meeting his, her voice firm, resolute. "I am Edward," she said. "I love him, and I believe in our future together." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "He seems a good man," he said, his voice hesitant. "A strong man. But trust is a fragile thing, Juliana, especially between our families." "I know, Edward," she replied, "but trust can be earned, and love can conquer even the deepest of hatreds." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, a gesture of brotherly affection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that still connected them, despite the choices she had made, despite the path she had chosen. "Be careful, Juliana," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Be vigilant. There are those who would see this union fail." "I will, Edward," she said. "I promise you." He smiled, a small, sad smile, but filled with a glimmer of hope. "Then may the gods be with you, sister," he said. "May your marriage be blessed with happiness, with peace, with love." He turned to leave, but then paused at the doorway, looking back at her. I brought you something," he said, his voice hesitant. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, worn object, a locket, a silver locket shaped like a thorn, a symbol of their family, of their heritage. "It was our mother's," he said, his voice choked with emotion. She would have wanted you to have it." Juliana took the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate design, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. It was a reminder of her past, of her family, of the life she had left behind, but it was also a symbol of connection, of continuity, of a love that transcended boundaries, that defied the odds. She clasped the locket around her neck, feeling its weight against her skin, a tangible reminder of her brother's love, of her family's heritage, of the strength she drew from her roots. She left the chapel, her heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose, of determination. She would face the future, whatever it held, with courage, with grace, with love. She would honor her vows, not only to Montrose, but to her family, to her people, to herself. The wedding ceremony was held in the Great Hall, the same hall where she had first met Montrose, where she had been his prisoner, where their love had blossomed amidst the shadows of their family's enmity. The hall was transformed, decorated with flowers, with banners, with symbols of both houses, a testament to their union, to their hope for a future of peace and reconciliation. Montrose stood at the altar, resplendent in a tunic of deep blue, embroidered with silver falcons, his eyes shining with love, with anticipation. He watched her walk down the aisle, her head held high, her gaze fixed on his, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and joy. As she reached him, he took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his grip firm, reassuring. He smiled at her, a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, a smile that spoke of a love that had endured, that had overcome, that had triumphed. The ceremony proceeded, the vows spoken, the rings exchanged, the blessings given. But amidst the pomp and circumstance, amidst the cheers and applause, Juliana felt a constant undercurrent of tension, a sense of imminent danger. She scanned the crowd, her eyes searching for any sign of threat, any indication of Alara's plot. She saw faces filled with joy, with hope, but she also saw faces filled with doubt, with suspicion, with resentment. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement, a glint of metal, a figure moving towards Montrose, a dagger raised. It happened so fast. One moment, vows of love and unity. The next, the cold gleam of steel. This time, It was not a coerced servant, but a woman, a noble woman, a distant cousin of Montrose, a woman who had always been loyal to Alara, a woman who had always resented Juliana. Juliana reacted instinctively, without thought, without hesitation. She stepped in front of Montrose, shielding him with her body, taking the blow that was meant for him. A sharp, searing pain ripped through her shoulder. A cry escaped her lips. A gasp went up from the crowd. The dagger, meant for Montrose's heart, had found its mark in her flesh. But even as she fell, even as the pain consumed her, she saw the love in Montrose's eyes, the horror, the anguish, the determination. She saw him move, swift and decisive, disarming the woman, protecting her, saving her, just as he had promised. The wedding, meant to be a celebration of love and unity, had become a scene of violence, of betrayal, of sacrifice. But even in the midst of chaos, even in the face of death, their love endured, their bond strengthened, their commitment reaffirmed. The question of where honor lay had been answered, not in words, but in a selfless act of love, a desperate attempt to protect the one she loved, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. The great hall descended into chaos. Screams mingled with shouts of alarm as Montrose, his face a mask of fury and fear, caught Juliana as she fell. The would-be assassin, Lady Isolde, was swiftly apprehended by the guards, her face contorted with a mixture of hatred and frustrated ambition. Montrose knelt, cradling Juliana in his arms, his hands desperately trying to stem the flow of blood from her shoulder. His voice, usually so calm and controlled, was thick with panic. "Get a healer.
Now."
The festive atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a chilling silence broken only by Juliana's ragged breaths and Montrose's frantic commands. Edward rushed to his sister's side, his face pale with shock and concern, his own distrust momentarily forgotten in the face of this brutal attack. Juliana, despite the searing pain, managed a weak smile, her hand reaching up to touch Montrose's cheek. I am all right," she whispered, her voice strained. "It is just a scratch." But it was no mere scratch. The dagger had plunged deep, and the blood was soaking through her wedding gown, staining the ivory silk a gruesome crimson. The healer arrived, his face grim as he examined the wound. He worked quickly, efficiently, his hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. He cleaned the wound, applied herbs and bandages, his every movement precise and practiced. Montrose never left Juliana's side, his eyes fixed on her face, his hand holding hers, his presence a source of strength, of comfort, of unwavering love. "You saved my life, my lady," he said, his voice choked with emotion. You took the blow that was meant for me." Juliana managed a weak smile. "I would do it again," she whispered. I love you." Her words, spoken amidst the pain and chaos, were a testament to the depth of her love, to the strength of her commitment, to the unbreakable bond that had formed between them. After what felt like an eternity, the healer finally stepped back, his face still grave, but with a hint of relief. "The bleeding has stopped," he said, "but the wound is deep. She needs rest and time to heal." Montrose carefully lifted Juliana in his arms, carrying her to their chambers, his every movement gentle, protective. He laid her on the bed, his eyes never leaving hers, his heart aching with a mixture of fear and gratitude. The wedding celebrations were cancelled. The guests dispersed, the great hall silent and empty, a stark contrast to the joyous scene it had been just hours before. Draken held its breath, waiting, praying for Juliana's recovery. The following days were a blur of pain, of fever, of delirium. Juliana drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fragmented images, with whispers of voices, with the constant, reassuring presence of Montrose. He never left her side, except for brief moments to oversee the investigation into the assassination attempt, to ensure that justice was served, to protect his people, his home, his wife. He learned that Lady Isolde had been acting on Alara's orders, that she had been promised power and influence in exchange for eliminating Juliana, for paving the way for Alara's return to power. Alara, even from her prison cell, remained a formidable threat, her influence reaching far beyond the walls that confined her. Montrose ordered Alara's confinement to be made even stricter, her communication with the outside world severed completely. He vowed to make her pay for her treachery, for the pain she had inflicted, for the threat she still posed. But his primary focus was on Juliana, on her recovery, on her well-being. He sat by her bedside, holding her hand, speaking to her, reading to her, singing to her, his love a constant, unwavering presence, a beacon in the darkness that threatened to engulf her. Slowly, gradually, Juliana began to heal. The fever subsided, the pain lessened, her mind cleared. She opened her eyes, her gaze finding Montrose's, her heart filling with a love that was stronger, deeper, more profound than ever before. You stayed, she whispered, her voice weak, but filled with gratitude. He smiled, a tired smile, but filled with relief, with love. I will always stay, my lady, he said. I will never leave your side. Her recovery was slow and arduous, but with Montrose's unwavering support, with the care of the healer, with her own strength and resilience, she began to regain her health, her vitality, her spirit. The heart's reckoning had been brutal, a test of their love, of their commitment, of their resilience. But they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness that had threatened to consume them. The attack, meant to destroy their union, had instead solidified it, proving that their love was not a fragile flower, but a deeply rooted tree, capable of weathering any storm. Chapter 19. Flames of Defiance. Juliana's recovery was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and the unwavering love and care of Montrose. As she regained her health, she also regained her determination, her resolve to fight for the future they had envisioned, a future free from the shadows of the past, from the constant threat of treachery and betrayal. She knew that Alara was still a danger, that she would not give up her ambition, her desire for power, her hatred for Juliana. She knew that they had to find a way to neutralize her, to permanently remove her from the equation, to ensure the safety and security of Draken, of their future together. She spoke to Montrose about her concerns, her voice firm, resolute, her eyes filled with a newfound fire, a fierce determination that mirrored his own. We cannot allow her to continue to plot against us, she said. We cannot live in constant fear, always looking over our shoulders. We must end this. Montrose nodded, his expression grim, his jaw tightening, his hand clenching into a fist. He had been grappling with the same thoughts, the same concerns, the same need for decisive action. I agree, my lady, he said. But how? She is already imprisoned. Her communication with the outside world has been severed. Juliana paused, her mind racing, considering the options, weighing the risks. She knew that there was only one way, one drastic measure that would ensure their safety, that would eliminate the threat of Alara once and for all. There is only one way, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a chilling certainty. She must be executed. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications, with the weight of centuries of tradition, of law, of morality. Executing a noblewoman, even one who had attempted murder, was a drastic step, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Montrose looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and understanding. He knew that she was right, that there was no other way to guarantee their safety, to secure their future. But he also knew the cost, the moral implications, the potential backlash. It is a harsh sentence, my lady, he said, his voice hesitant. A sentence that will not be easily accepted.
By some.
Juliana met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I know, she said. But it is the only way. She will never stop, Montrose. She will continue to plot, to scheme, to threaten us until she is gone. He was silent for a long moment, his mind grappling with the decision, with the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. He looked at Juliana, his eyes filled with love, with admiration, with respect. He saw her strength, her courage, her willingness to do whatever it took to protect their future, to secure their love. He reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Then we will do it," he said, his voice firm, resolute. Together. They knew that they would face opposition, that there would be those who would condemn their decision, who would see it as an act of tyranny, of cruelty. But they were prepared. They had the support of the majority of the people of Draken, they had the evidence of Alera's treachery, and they had their own unwavering belief in the righteousness of their cause. They announced their decision publicly, explaining their reasons, presenting the evidence, justifying their actions. They spoke of Alera's repeated attempts to destabilize Draken, to assassinate Juliana, to seize power for herself. They spoke of the need for justice, for security, for a future free from fear. As expected, there was dissent. Some of the nobles, those who had been loyal to Alera, those who feared Montrose's growing power, protested the decision, arguing that it was too harsh, that it violated tradition, that it set a dangerous precedent. But Montrose stood firm, his voice ringing with authority, his eyes filled with a cold, hard light. He would not be swayed, he would not be intimidated, he would not allow anyone to stand in the way of justice, of security, of their future together. The execution was carried out swiftly, discreetly, in the courtyard of the castle, at dawn. Alera, her face pale but defiant, met her fate with a chilling composure, her eyes filled with hatred, with resentment, with a refusal to acknowledge her defeat. Juliana did not attend the execution. She could not bear to witness the death of another human being, even one who had sought to destroy her. She remained in her chambers, praying for Alera's soul, praying for forgiveness, praying for peace. Montrose returned to her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. He took her in his arms, holding her close, his presence a source of comfort, of strength, of unwavering love. "It is over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She is gone." Juliana nodded, her body trembling with reaction, with the release of tension that had been building for so long. She knew that it was the right decision, the only decision, but it was still a heavy burden to bear, a stain on their conscience, a reminder of the darkness they had faced, of the sacrifices they had made. The flames of defiance had burned bright, consuming the thread of Alera, but leaving behind a residue of ash, of regret, of the knowledge that even the most righteous actions could come at a cost. But even in the aftermath of this difficult decision, their love remained, a beacon of hope, a testament to their resilience, a promise of a future that, though marked by the past, could still be filled with light, with joy, with peace. They had extinguished one fire, only to find their own burning even brighter. Chapter 20. A Kingdom's Dawn. The death of Alera marked a turning point in the history of Draken. It was a decisive act, a clear message that treachery would not be tolerated, that the new order, the union of Thornmere and Montrose, would be defended at all costs. It brought a sense of closure, of finality, but it also left a void, a sense of unease, a reminder of the darkness that had lurked within the castle walls. Juliana and Montrose knew that they had to move forward, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted, to build a future based on trust, on unity, on a shared vision of peace and prosperity. They had to prove that their love, their marriage, was not a source of weakness, but a source of strength, a foundation for a new era. They began by consolidating their power, strengthening their alliances, rewarding those who had remained loyal, and extending a hand of reconciliation to those who had opposed them, offering them a chance to redeem themselves, to join the new order. They focused on rebuilding Draken, not just the physical structures, but the spirit of the people. They invested in the community, supporting local businesses, improving infrastructure, creating opportunities for growth and development. Juliana, fully recovered from her injury, took an active role in the governance of Draken, working alongside Montrose, advising him, guiding him, sharing her wisdom, her compassion, her unique perspective as a woman, as a former outsider, as a bridge between two worlds. She championed the cause of education, establishing schools and libraries, promoting literacy and learning, empowering the people of Draken with knowledge, with the ability to shape their own destinies. She also focused on fostering understanding and cooperation between the people of Draken and Thornmere, encouraging cultural exchange, promoting trade, breaking down the barriers of prejudice and mistrust that had separated them for so long. She organized joint festivals, shared celebrations, opportunities for the people of both lands to come together, to interact, to learn from each other, to discover their common humanity, to build a foundation for a lasting peace. Edward, initially hesitant and distrustful, gradually came to accept the union, to see the benefits of cooperation, to recognize the genuine love and commitment between Juliana and Montrose. He visited Draken, he participated in the joint councils. He began to forge a new relationship with Montrose, a relationship based on mutual respect, on a shared desire for peace and prosperity. The wounds of the past were not completely healed. The scars remained, but a new sense of hope, of possibility, began to emerge. The people of Draken and Thornmere, once sworn enemies, began to see each other as neighbors, as partners, as allies. Juliana and Montrose, through their love, their leadership, their unwavering commitment to a better future, had transformed their kingdoms, had created a new reality, a new dawn. One evening, as they stood together on the battlements of Draken, overlooking the moonlit landscape, the rolling hills and lush meadows that stretched out before them, Juliana felt a sense of completion, of fulfillment, of profound gratitude. "We did it, my lord," she said, her voice soft, but filled with emotion. "We overcame." Montrose smiled, his eyes shining with love, with admiration. He reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers interlacing with hers. "We did, my lady," he said. "Together." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "And this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is only the beginning." He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was deep, passionate, tender. It was a kiss of gratitude, of commitment, of a love that had endured, that had triumphed, that had transformed their world. As they stood there, bathed in the moonlight, the wind whispering around them, the stars shining above them, they knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be new challenges, new obstacles, new threats to face. But they also knew that they could face anything together. Their love, their union, had become a symbol of hope, of reconciliation, of a new era, a kingdom's dawn. The past, with its shadows and scars, could not be erased, but it no longer defined them. They had built something new, something stronger, something beautiful. The dawn had broken, not just over Draken and Thornmere, but over their hearts, illuminating a future filled with promise, with peace, with love. They were no longer just a knight and his captive, a lord and a lady, but a king and a queen, in their hearts if not in name, rulers of a united land, bound by a love that had conquered all. Epilogue. Years passed, flowing like the river that wound its way through the valleys of Draken and Thornmere, now united lands, their people intertwined, their destinies forever linked. The scars of the past remained, visible reminders of the battles fought, the sacrifices made, the love that had endured. But they were no longer open wounds, but rather the marks of resilience, of strength, of a peace forged in the fires of adversity. Juliana and Montrose ruled wisely and justly, their reign marked by prosperity, by growth, by a blossoming of culture and understanding. They fostered trade, encouraged education, promoted the arts, creating a society where all could thrive, where differences were celebrated, where unity was not just a word, but a way of life. The Great Hall of Draken, once a scene of conflict and betrayal, became a place of gathering, of celebration, of shared meals and joyful reunions. The echoes of laughter and music replaced the whispers of conspiracy and fear. The tapestries depicting scenes of hunt and hawk were joined by new ones, depicting scenes of peace, of unity, of a love that had conquered all. Edward, now a frequent visitor to Draken, had become a trusted advisor, a friend, a brother to Montrose. The bond between the two men, once strained by centuries of animosity, had grown strong, forged in mutual respect, in a shared commitment to the well-being of their people. And Juliana blossomed. No longer a captive, no longer a pawn, but a queen in her own right, a leader, a visionary, a woman who had found her voice, her purpose, her home. She walked the halls of Draken, not with trepidation, but with confidence, with grace, with the quiet authority of one who had earned her place, not through birthright, but through love, through courage, through unwavering determination. One spring morning, as she stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, now bursting with life, with color, with the fragrance of roses and lilies, she felt a familiar stirring within her, a new life growing, a symbol of hope, of continuity, of the enduring power of love. She turned to find Montrose standing behind her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache with joy. He had sensed it, too, the miracle that was unfolding, the promise of a new generation, a generation that would inherit a world free from the hatreds of the past, a world built on the foundations of their love, their sacrifice, their unwavering belief in a better future. He reached out, his hand gently caressing her abdomen, his touch a silent vow, a promise of protection, of devotion, of a love that would endure, that would transcend time, that would forever bind them together. A child, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. A son or a daughter of Draken and Thornmere. Juliana smiled, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. A child, she echoed, her voice filled with wonder, with gratitude. A symbol of our love. They stood there, together, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, their hearts overflowing with a love that had conquered all, a love that had transformed their world, a love that would continue to grow, to flourish, to illuminate the lives of generations to come. The child, a living testament to their union, would carry the legacy of their love, a legacy of peace, of unity, of a kingdom forever changed by the courage of a knight and the heart of his captive. And, within the safety of the walls, and within the circle of their boundless love, the child would be free. The future stretched before them, unwritten, unmapped, but filled with the promise of a dawn that had finally arrived, a dawn brought about not by conquest, but by love. The end.